Hello PHP nutters and welcome to Never Trust Users Part 2 in our thrilling series How Not to Write PHP. In this episode we'll be taking a look at basic server-side validation because, as the title suggests, you never know what naughtiness your users are up to. And we're back to the to the same code, in fact, because we have some unfinished business. If you didn't see part 1 of Never Trust Users, this happened. That's not good, and I really wish I had a backup. Yep, we suffered from a pretty catastrophic SQL injection attack, which, I might add, we managed to thwart with MySQL prepared statements, which you will see here. But if you want to see how we did it, please have a look at video number 1. But let's not dwell on the past, let's move forward and start looking into server-side validation, because our friend's first name and last name are not being validated whatsoever, which means we can put just about anything we want into first name and last name in the database, and yeah, that's not a good thing. But Jeff, we've got parameterized queries now. What's the worst that can happen? Well, I'm glad you asked, because I'm going to tell you. Although second-order SQL injection is a threat, given that we're using parameterized queries everywhere, it becomes less of a threat. So remember to always use parameterized queries and never attempt to be lazy and inject variables into your SQL. What is a threat in this script, and I'm going to adjust this script to demonstrate it, is cross-site scripting, and it is one of the most common threats that people fall foul of. Now, cross-site scripting can be used by attackers for a multitude of sins, and that can include embedding something nasty into your website or obtaining sensitive information about your session. So let's just do the first one, and let's embed something nasty into the website. So how am I going to achieve that? Well, knowing that I do, that first name or last name is not actually validated and is entered into the database, and is also, where has it gone? Is also shown in the fields here. What I can do is add a speech mark, add some HTML, add my embed, and submit. That has saved. So if I go back to the page, oh my god, that's hideous. Nope, that's definitely malicious. Let's undo that. So in the database, we can see that if I refresh my data, I can see that the information added into the field has been added perfectly fine, but that's not desirable because when we're echoing it out, is actually corrupting my page. Now imagine if that was an iframe or some dodgy JavaScript. In fact, let's just do that. Let's simulate some JavaScript. So let's have some sensitive information, which requires us to have a session. All right. Okay, so what I want to be able to do is go into my application here, have a look at my cookies, and you can see that I have some session IDs here. Let's just reset my data, just so it's not quite so bad. We'll start with some fresh data. Come on, that's better. Okay, let's go in there. Okay, so now I have a session ID, which I created using session start. Now, the key thing to take note of here is it's not HTTP only and it's not secure, so I'm already in problems. So let's do the same thing again. And this time I'm going to add some JavaScript. And just so we can see what I'm doing, let's alert my document cookie. Okay, there you go. Submit that. Go back, and it's outputting my session cookie here. Now that's a bad thing because it doesn't take a stretch of the imagination to see how capturing my session ID could lead to a session hijacking, which, if I was in an authenticated session, could lead to all sorts of issues. So let's take a look at our form to see what's going on. If I just click OK just here, you can see that my form has been messed up, the HTML here. And if I head into my database, we can see that the data has gone in, my script has gone in, and if I inspect the code here, you can see that the quotation mark and the right angle bracket entered here is completing my input field and is then allowing the additional HTML to render outside of the input field, and then the additional required information that was a part of my original input field is just displaying as text on the page, and that's a bad thing. So we need to be able to protect against this first. So we're going to escape the content of this field in the database so that that doesn't happen. Okay, so let's go back into the code and go down to our field. And what we're going to do is escape our first name and our last name. So I'm actually going to create a small function up here. Now, normally, obviously, my code would be a lot more complicated, but I'm just going to escape a string, and that is going to be my input. And that will return a string, which we hope, and we're going to just return HTML special chars of my input. Okay, in fact, I'm just going to call this escape string. All right, let's escape our strings down here and here. All right, okay, and I'll go back to my page and re-render my page. And you can see that now that I've escaped this string and escaped essentially all of the naughty things that this person has put in, is now forming a proper value. And if I was to save this form again, given that this script is still in there, if I submit, it has saved. And it's still, if I re-render the page, it's still coming up in the value here. If I look in the database, it's still got the same value here. So we're successfully not corrupting or not actually manipulating the data that's submitted. It's just being able to render it properly within our HTML input field. So that's that done. The next challenge is to actually strip out the HTML code, the script, which we shouldn't be allowing when the form is submitted. To do that, we need to identify the point at which the form is submitted. Now, in our code, that is here. Now, this is not ideal, and I'll explain why this is not ideal, because this is actually behind the scenes. This is going to be creating some notices or warnings, the fact that this may not be set. I'll come back to that in another video, I think, because that's worth mentioning. But what we're going to do is intercept here where our form is being submitted. So what we're going to do is filter. We're going to sanitize our data first. So I have prepared some code here just to save some typing. Alrighty, and I'll explain what is going on here. So what we're doing is we're taking our first name, which is taking the post data, and we're using a built-in PHP function called filter_var. If you don't know those, it's worth looking up. And we're putting in the post data that was posted by the user, and we are sanitizing the string to strip out any undesirable characters, including HTML. But I am going to allow quotes. Now, there is a reason for that, because technically a quote is a valid character and it should be allowed. But you can debate that all you like, but technically it should be allowed. And also, because we're escaping our strings, it should be safe. So we're going to also trim white space from the front and back to the left and right of our first name. And what we're going to do is do exactly the same for our last name. So let's have a look at last name. Last name. Cool. Then we can head back into our web page and try this out again. So I still have my script here. I'm going to resubmit, saved, go back, refresh, and you can see that the script has been removed from the field. And if I go into my database, you can see that script is here. If I refresh, script has been removed. However, I still have the quotation mark and the greater than symbol, which technically are both perfectly valid, especially if you, say, for example, had a product title where you might be measuring something in feet, or you might have, say, is greater than a certain price. Now, those are acceptable, but not in a first name environment. So that's where our validation comes in. Okay, so let's head back into the code. And our validation will always appear after we sanitize. So we would do validation here. So we just do validate. Okay. Now, the type of validation that you would do would depend upon what you accept. So first name might be different from last name, or if you had a product title, it would be different again. So it's very much a kind of case-by-case thing. And what you would do is you would build up an ecosystem of validators. Now, in this example, we can't really do that because our code is too simple and it would take way too long to start building that. However, I will be doing videos on how to build a validation system and a form system, which we'll do in another video, or over a series of videos. But in this case, what we're going to do is run something very, very simple. Now, usually you would want to validate several things. You'd want to validate, say, the format of a string, the characters that the string contains, and the length of the string. And each of those should be a separate validation piece. So let's start with the characters that we allow. So in the first name, I'm going to just demonstrate something that I see quite often. So I say if, in fact, actually I have a prepared bit of code, which will save me a bit of typing, and then I'll just explain what it means. So if you haven't got into regular expressions, I strongly urge you to try and understand them, because as you progress in programming, regular expressions become increasingly useful. So what we're saying here is we're starting a pattern where the beginning of the string between the beginning of the string and the end of the string, we are requiring a character set A to Z, one or more characters, and it's case insensitive. And if it doesn't match this, we're going to say first name invalid. All right, okay, so if we go into our page and then we submit our form, you'll find that our first name is invalid because we have some invalid characters that do not match our A to Z pattern. So if we were to delete this and just submit Joe, we should expect that it does save, which it does because Joe matches A to Z. However, things are not quite as rosy as we might like because our first name pattern here doesn't allow us to deal with names with apostrophes in, so it wouldn't be suitable for last name for things like O'Connor. It also doesn't cater for names with spaces hyphens, say double-barreled names, things like that. And it also doesn't allow us to validate multilingual names. So for example, if I was to add in the name Wang into here, it's going to come up as invalid. Now this is a Chinese character, so we're not being able to validate for these things. Now, what you validate and what you accept is up to the systems that you build, but you should be trying to make things fairly flexible without and not making them too rigid, but it's still enforcing some level of validation. So we can, I've got a little bit of a code here that will allow us to accept Wang. Right, I'm going to paste this in. So this is a Unicode flag. And what we're doing here is we're allowing letters, separators, and punctuation. Again, if you're not used to regular expressions, please do feel free to check them out. They're extremely useful. So we're going to go back in here, resubmit Wang, and it has saved. Awesome. Right, we can move on. Now, the same issue is true with string length. Now, if I was to echo the string length of our first name and exit, go back into our form and resubmit, it says 3, even though we have 1 character here. And that's because string length isn't UTF-8 safe, because it is in fact based on the number of bytes and assumes that a single character is 1 byte. But because the Chinese character is 3 bytes, this is telling us that the string length is 3. Interestingly, MySQL, if you're designing your database tables, will be exactly the same. So the length of my varchar here is 255, which is probably too large, but that is telling me these 255 bytes, not 255 characters. If I wanted to see how many characters there actually are, I should use MB string length, which is the multi-byte version. So if I go into here and submit, that now is telling me it is 1 character, not 1 byte. So whenever you are designing your string length validators to say, I want to accept only strings less than or equal to a certain number of characters, you should probably use MB string length rather than string length. And if you are designing a multilingual system, you should keep in mind that the number of bytes is, or the number of characters isn't necessarily what you see in MySQL. So you might need maybe 3 times the size that you potentially think. But obviously Chinese names tend to be a lot shorter. So, finding the balance is, just have more than you kind of need. And then in your PHP, you would have shorter lengths than you would in your database. Okay, with that in mind, we can actually change our echo here to an if. So if MB string length is greater than, let's say, 30 characters, because that's a fairly generous size, echo first name too long, exit. Okay. Right, so now we've validated our name. This might not be a perfect validator, but again, you should tweak it according to your needs. And here we've got, what is this? Missing in Composer. Okay, ignore that. And if our string length is greater than 30 characters, which it shouldn't be, then the first name is too long. This just prevents things erroring out in the database rather than in our code, because we want to try and keep the errors within our, within the scope of the script, within our application, and not rely on the database to give us error reports. Okay, so then once this has successfully gone through validation, and I would normally do the same for last name, you can then allow the script to update the user. Okay, so the next thing I want to address, and is really important to take note of, is in the form itself, I had 2 required fields. Now, it's really easy for an attacker to remove HTML attributes or to disable JavaScript. So if you are going to have required fields, or if you do have JavaScript validation, you should reflect those validations within your server-side scripts. So in order to achieve this for a required field, I would make sure that if there is no string length of, let's say, fname, echo first name is required. Exit. Okay, so I can try that in my web page and delete the wang from my form and remove the required field, because if I was to submit this now, it would say this is required, and remove it in my HTML, submit, and then first name is required. So good, that's validating the fact that there's no presence of the HTML required attribute. Okay, so some closing remarks for this video, because I think we've gone on long enough, and I think we've effectively demonstrated how we can protect ourselves against cross-site scripting and sanitizing data coming in from post requests and validating data to make it to ensure that the data is as we expect after sanitization. However, this script is extremely simplistic, and we wouldn't normally do things this way. Normally, we would have separate classes for our sanitizers, and by that I mean there would be a separate class for sanitizing the string, an individual class for whitespace trimming. You would also have separate classes for validation, which would include a required validator, a name validator in this example, and a string length validator, in this case a maximum string length. So generally those would be encapsulated within their own classes, which would allow us to implement test-driven development, where we could test each individual class to death. We would test as many scenarios as we could possibly think of, and when we encounter new scenarios, we can add those into our tests. So you wouldn't also echo out upon each instance of the error occurring, because that's really, really bad user experience. Normally we would accumulate our error messages within our error handlers, and we would try and output those errors upon failure next to the field that it applies to. So I don't think we have time to do anything like that in this video. I will be doing form validators. I will be doing videos on building a whole validator ecosystem, maybe not in one video, but maybe over a series. And if you want to see that, please subscribe. If you liked this video and the content within it, please give me a like, a thumbs up. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the next video.